Hello everyone. Before we start, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is for you. That's how YouTube keeps sending you stories like this. And now, let's get into it. I'd lived in that duplex for almost 6 months by then. It was an old 2-story unit with thin walls, creaky floors, and a basement I avoided unless something actually needed fixing. I didn't like that basement. It always smelled faintly of damp earth and rusted metal, even when it hadn't rained in weeks. My roommate usually stayed with her boyfriend a few nights a week, but that night she was out of town, Chicago, for some conference. It was the first time I had the entire place to myself overnight. The street outside was quiet. The duplex sat on the corner of a side street where there weren't many cars at night. A single street lamp stood across from the house, its orange glow reaching through the kitchen window and falling onto the tile floor like a dull, narrow beam. I'd spent the night half watching random shows on my laptop upstairs. The only sound was the faint ticking of the radiator pipes and the distant hum of a train somewhere miles away. It was a little after 1 in the morning when I got thirsty. I remember checking the time on my phone. 1:47 a.m. I was wrapped in an old sweatshirt, barefoot, and still half distracted by whatever episode I'd paused upstairs. When I came down the staircase, I noticed the air felt different. It wasn't just cooler. It had that slight, strange chill I always felt near the kitchen late at night. That came from the basement. The door was right next to the fridge. I always kept it closed because of the draft the old furnace created. But tonight, it wasn't closed. It was cracked open a few inches. That door was heavy. It didn't just swing open on its own. It had this way of catching against the frame. You had to give it a small shove to get it to budge. Seeing it open like that made the back of my neck tighten instantly. I froze halfway across the kitchen. The fridge hummed quietly behind me. I reached for the light switch on the wall and flipped it. The kitchen light flickered on for half a second, bright enough to make me squint, and then it clicked off. Not a power outage. Everything else in the house still buzzed faintly. I flipped it again, but it stayed dead. The hallway light behind me was still on. It was just the kitchen. At first I thought maybe the bulb had burned out, but then I noticed something worse. The thin strip of orange light from the street lamp outside fell directly on the kitchen floor every night. Like clockwork, I'd seen it 100 times. But now part of that light was missing. It was cut off, like something was blocking it from just outside the view of the open basement doorway. The air felt heavy. It wasn't just my imagination. The furnace made this low rattling sound downstairs sometimes, but right then it was silent. I stared at that doorway, and the longer I stared, the more I could feel my pulse hammering in my chest. I didn't want to make any noise. I kept my steps slow and quiet, sliding my feet along the tile toward the front door. My keys were still on the hook by the coat rack. I grabbed them without letting them jingle. The only sound was the faint creaking of the floor beneath my feet. My throat felt dry and tight. I could feel the draft coming out of that stairwell. A cold, damp smell of dirt, and something faintly metallic. I'd just reached the front door when I heard it. A whisper. Low. Calm. It came from directly beneath the kitchen floorboards. A man's voice, not loud but clear enough to feel like it was just a few feet away. He's up. The sound slid through the floor, steady and confident, like someone was talking to someone else in the dark down there. My body locked up. I didn't breathe. My hands were shaking so hard the keys almost slipped from between my fingers. There wasn't any mistaking it. It wasn't the pipes. It wasn't the furnace. It was a voice. I turned the deadbolt as quietly as I could. My hands felt numb, like the blood had rushed out of them. I didn't even think about a jacket or shoes. I pulled the door open and bolted out onto the porch barefoot. The cold air slapped my face and the concrete under my feet stung, but I didn't stop. I didn't even look back. I just ran. The neighborhood was dead quiet at that hour. No cars, no lights on in any houses. The only sound was the hard slapping of my feet against the pavement. I ran down the block and turned the corner without slowing. My chest burned. but I didn't stop until I reached the porch of an older couple's house 2 streets over. I'd waved at them a few times before but never talked to them. I pounded on their door, then crouched on the steps, still clutching my keys like a weapon even though I knew they wouldn't help. The porch light came on a few moments later. They must have called the police because within minutes I saw the faint red and blue glow reflecting off the houses. When the officers went into my place, they didn't find anyone in the open part of the basement. What they did find was worse. The old duplex had a crawl space I'd never paid attention to. A low, narrow opening tucked behind the old water heater. I'd seen the water heater plenty of times, but never noticed the crawl space. It wasn't much bigger than the length of a person, and you had to crouch to get in. It was hidden enough that you'd never see it unless you were looking for it. Inside, they found muddy boot prints, a half-empty water bottle, a dirty sleeping bag, and a small plastic bag with some junk inside, empty wrappers, a cheap lighter, a folded shirt. Someone had been living down there, not for one night, for a while, long enough to make a small nest out of the corner of my basement. They figured whoever it was must have slipped out the back door before I ran, maybe through the small ground-level window at the far end of the basement. It wasn't locked. I hadn't even realized it could open. Standing in the front yard in the police light, I looked at that basement window and felt this deep, cold weight settle in my stomach. The thought of how many nights I'd fallen asleep upstairs while someone was camped out beneath my feet made my skin crawl. All those little things I'd brushed off suddenly made sense. The draft I couldn't explain. The faint smell I thought was just the furnace. The few times I'd heard soft noises at night and assumed it was the house settling. I'd always thought of danger as something loud, something you saw coming. I'd never thought of it as someone lying quiet beneath your floor, waiting. I stayed at a friend's house for the rest of the week. I couldn't make myself walk back into that kitchen at night. The landlord had a crew come in to seal off the crawl space completely, installing a locked steel grate over the opening. But even after they were done, I knew I'd never feel the same in that house again. I moved out less than a month later. When I was packing the last of my things, I walked past that kitchen door and thought about how easy it had been for someone to be so close without me ever knowing. The door stayed shut, the light worked fine, and the street lamp still cast its usual narrow beam on the tile. Everything looked normal, but I knew better now. The house had never really been empty. It had just been quiet, too quiet. I live alone on a quiet street in a neighborhood where nothing ever really happens. It's one of those older streets where the houses sit close together, but not close enough to actually hear anyone else. My place is a small 2-story house with a front porch, a narrow driveway, and a fenced backyard that's always a little too dark at night. I've never felt unsafe there. In fact, one of the reasons I chose this place was because of how quiet it is. No loud neighbors, no heavy traffic, no suspicious activity. Just silence most nights, except for the occasional barking dog down the street or the sound of wind scraping through the trees. That night I had gone to bed around midnight. The rain had started just after 11, soft at first, then steadier, tapping against the window above my bed. I remember checking the clock once more before drifting off. It was 12:48 a.m. The rain was still coming down. I left the small lamp on in the hallway upstairs, the one with the warm, yellow light that spills softly onto the landing. I always keep that light on when I sleep alone. When the doorbell rang, the sound cut straight through the quiet of the house. It was 3:12 a.m. I remember the exact time because I turned my head toward the alarm clock on my nightstand, squinting through the half-dark. At first, I wasn't even sure what I'd heard. The rain had softened again, and for a moment I thought maybe it was just something falling outside. But then it rang again. The sound was sharp and clear, that short, high-pitched ding of the old doorbell that came with the house. My body reacted before my brain did. I froze, completely still under the blanket, staring at the ceiling like I could figure everything out by not moving. My heart started pounding so hard it almost hurt. No one rings a doorbell at 3 in the morning. Not here, not on this street. I don't have family nearby. I don't have friends who show up without warning. There was no reason for anyone to be at my door. The doorbell rang again. Not a long press, just quick taps. Someone impatient. Someone who knew they were pressing it. I stayed in bed for what felt like a long time, but couldn't have been more than 30 seconds. The house was silent except for the faint dripping of rain off the gutters and my own breathing. I slowly pushed the blanket away and sat up. My feet hit the cold floor. I didn't turn on the bedroom light. I didn't want whoever was out there to know I was awake. My bedroom is at the top of the stairs, and from there I can see down the hallway but not the front door. There's a frosted glass panel next to the door, old and cloudy, so from upstairs I wouldn't be able to see a face even if I tried. But I could see movement sometimes, just shapes, outlines. I crept to the top of the stairs and crouched down, keeping my body low. The light from the hallway behind me cast a soft glow down the steps, and I felt exposed just standing there. The doorbell didn't ring again immediately. Whoever was out there had stopped pressing it. I leaned slightly forward and stared at that frosted glass pane. For a few seconds, nothing. Then a shape, a shadow, a blurred silhouette standing perfectly still just beyond the glass. Not shifting, not pacing, just there. My heart was slamming in my chest so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't move down the stairs. I stayed on the top step, holding my breath, waiting for something to happen. In a normal situation, someone would ring the bell a few times and leave, or knock, or say something. This person did none of that. They just stood there. 1 minute passed, then 2. The rain outside tapped lightly against the roof, against the windows. I could feel the weight of their presence on the other side of the door, like they were listening too. I whispered to myself, just wait them out. Just stay quiet. They'll go. I shifted my weight backward, about to back away from the stairs when the doorbell rang again. Except the sound didn't come from the front. It came from the back door. For a second, I thought I was imagining it. My house only has one other door, in the kitchen, opening onto the small backyard. That door is almost never used. It doesn't even have a proper overhang, so anyone standing there in the rain would be getting soaked. But the sound had been clear and sharp. The same high-pitched ding. Someone had gone around to the back. I crouched even lower. The air in the house felt thick and heavy, like it was pressing down on me. My mind started racing through every possibility. Maybe someone was lost. Maybe a neighbor needed help. But no one walks around the house of a stranger at 3 a.m. in the rain, ringing every doorbell. I moved slowly down the stairs, keeping close to the wall, careful not to make the old wood creak. When I reached the bottom step, I could still see the silhouette by the front door. It hadn't left, which didn't make sense. The bell had rung at the back. How could they be at both doors? Unless there was more than one person. That thought hit me like a jolt of electricity. My skin crawled. I didn't turn on any lights. I wanted to stay invisible inside the house. I pressed myself against the wall near the living room and stayed perfectly still, listening. Nothing. Just rain. No footsteps. No voices. I waited like that for what felt like forever, straining to hear something. Then a faint sound, a soft thud against the side of the house. Then another. Footsteps in the wet grass. Someone was walking slowly around the house. I could hear the squelch of wet shoes against the ground, moving around the side toward the back. I turned toward the kitchen. There's a narrow hallway that connects the living room to the kitchen, and from there, you can see the back door. The house was pitch black except for the faint street light leaking through the blinds. I crept toward the kitchen, step by careful step, my socks silent on the floor. When I reached the doorway, I stopped. Through the small glass panel on the back door, I could see nothing but darkness. The motion sensor light I have back there didn't go on. It only turns on when someone gets close within a few feet. I stood there, barely breathing, waiting for it to flicker on. It did. The light snapped on suddenly, flooding the small concrete porch outside the back door. Rain glistened off the railing, but there was no one in view. Just wet steps, barely visible, leading away from the porch into the dark yard. The doorbell hadn't rung again, but someone was still out there. I backed away from the kitchen, keeping my eyes on the back door until I reached the living room wall again. I could still see the faint silhouette through the frosted glass by the front door. Still there. No movement. I didn't have a weapon in the house. I had never needed one. The best I could do was lock everything, which was already done, and wait. But the waiting was the worst part. Every second stretched too long. The house creaked in places I'd never noticed before. Then I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving along the side of the house. They circled. I could hear them crunching through the wet grass, stepping into puddles. They were walking around my house, not knocking, not calling out, just walking in slow, even laps. I glanced toward the small clock on the wall. 26 a.m. I had been frozen like this for over 10 minutes. My hands were shaking as I reached for my phone. I didn't turn on the screen at first because the glow might be visible through a window. I crouched behind the arm of the couch, low enough that no one outside could see me through the front glass. Then I unlocked the phone slowly, careful not to make noise with the buttons. The rain outside grew steadier again, but the footsteps didn't stop. I could hear them circling, front side, back side, front, over and over, like someone was pacing around the house, taking their time. The motion light out back flickered off, then on again a few minutes later when they passed. I called the police with trembling hands. I kept my voice low, almost whispering, afraid to let whoever was out there hear me. After I hung up, I didn't move. I stayed crouched behind the couch, my eyes fixed on the front door. I counted the seconds. The rain hit harder now, and the footsteps started blending with it. But every so often, I'd hear another faint thud against the wall, like they were brushing past it. I saw the silhouette shift for the first time, just slightly, a small lean to the side like they were adjusting their stance. I pressed my back harder against the couch. I could hear my breathing getting louder even though I was trying to keep it quiet. The police didn't arrive fast. It felt like hours, but it must have been about 20 minutes. At 3:47 a.m., headlights washed across the front windows. A car door slammed, then another. The silhouette vanished from the frosted glass just like that. No footsteps running, no sound of retreat. Just gone. When the police checked the perimeter, no one was there. But the evidence was everywhere. Wet shoe prints circled the house, not just once, but several times. Perfect uneven ring around the walls where someone had walked in the rain, over and over, pausing at both doors. The prints were wide, probably from heavy boots. One set of prints came right up to the front step. Another stopped just outside the back door where the motion light had flicked on. And then faintly they trailed off into the street and disappeared into the dark. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat in the living room until the sun came up, listening to the rain ease off, staring at the door. Nothing ever happens on my street. Not before that night. But I still live there. I changed the locks. I installed cameras, floodlights, alarms. But no matter how secure I make the house, every time it rains and I hear footsteps outside. I moved into the upper floor of that old house at the start of spring. The place had a strange charm to it. White paint chipped around the edges of the windows, uneven wooden floors, a narrow staircase with a banister that felt like it might give way if you leaned too hard. It wasn't perfect, but the rent was cheap and the neighborhood was quiet. The landlord told me the house was built over 100 years ago. The structure was solid, but the floors creaked no matter how carefully you stepped. It was one of those old house sounds I'd already gotten used to. Constant, harmless noise. I usually went to bed late. The house had a way of holding on to sound, and every night the settling made it feel alive. Pipes groaned, wood popped, the wind slipped through cracks. By the second week, those noises barely made me look up anymore. But that night was different. It was 11:28 p.m. I was lying in bed, my phone resting on my chest, the hallway light off. That's when I heard it. A creak, not random like usual, not from a corner or the ceiling. It came from the hallway, just outside my bedroom door. Then another, and another. Soft, steady, evenly spaced. At first I thought maybe it was the house again. Old wood shifting, a gust outside. But the sound didn't scatter the way old house noises usually did. It moved step by step. I could picture exactly where each footfall landed, like someone was walking slowly down the hall. My chest tightened. I held my breath, waiting for the sound to stop. It didn't. It grew closer until the next creak lined up with where my bedroom door was. I slid out of bed, moving carefully so the old floor wouldn't make a sound beneath me. I leaned toward the door, pressed my eye to the thin crack between the door and the frame. The hallway light switch was near the stairs, a little to the left of my door. From that angle, I could see nothing but the dark shape of the hallway wall. The footsteps stopped. Everything went quiet. I flicked the hallway light on. The yellow bulb filled the space with its weak, uneven glow. The hallway was empty. I stepped out slowly, checking the stairs. No one. The front door was locked. The windows were shut. I stood there for a long time, listening to my own pulse in my ears. Eventually, I convinced myself it must have been wood expanding again. Maybe an animal on the roof shifting weight somewhere. I turned off the light and went back to bed. But lying there, I couldn't relax. The sound hadn't been random. It had rhythm. I knew what footsteps sounded like. At around 12:15, I rolled onto my side, forcing myself to calm down. That's when I felt it, a faint, dull thud. It wasn't in the walls or above me. It came from beneath. At first it was soft, like a knock muffled through thick wood. Then again, and again, a steady push against the floorboards under my bed. It felt like something was pressing upward. I sat up, heart pounding hard enough to make my throat tight. I pushed my bare feet to the cold floor and knelt. The wood was rough under my hands. I pressed my ear against the boards. It was faint, but it was there. A slow, heavy breathing, not wind, not pipes, breathing. Someone was down there. I backed up fast, my hand hitting the nightstand hard enough to knock over the glass of water. It spilled across the floor, soaking the bottom of the rug. I kept staring at the floor like I expected it to break open. I wanted to leave the room, but the idea of stepping into that hallway again made my stomach twist. I sat there, back against the wall, waiting for the sound to come again. It didn't. The rest of the night was silent, but I barely slept. Every time the house shifted, I flinched. I kept checking the floor with the flashlight on my phone, like it might move. In the morning, the air was cool and still. Light came through the old glass panes, throwing pale streaks across the room. I checked every corner under the bed, ran my hand along the floorboards for any cracks or loose planks. There was nothing obvious. I went downstairs and walked around the outside of the house, searching for some kind of entrance beneath my unit. There wasn't one. The foundation was raised but solid, sealed off with stone and cement. When I called the landlord, my hands were still shaking. He sounded annoyed when I told him what I'd heard. I kept my voice steady, explaining the sound as plainly as I could. He said there was no crawl space under that part of the house. Just an old sub-basement sealed off years ago when they remodeled. No one went down there. There wasn't even an access door anymore. I didn't want to stay there another night, but I also didn't want to leave everything behind. I decided to set my phone to record audio before I went to bed. I placed it on the floor near the foot of my bed, screen down, microphone pointed at the boards. Then I turned off the light and lay in the dark. For the first hour, nothing. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. Then just after midnight, it started again. Soft creaking in the hallway. The same steady pace right outside my door. Then silence. Then the pressure under the floor. It was more forceful this time. A slow, deliberate push. It felt like the wood swelled beneath me. I gripped the edge of the mattress and didn't move. I didn't flick on the light this time. I just listened, counting the seconds between each sound. At around 1:37 a.m., there was a scraping noise from under the floor. Not nails on wood, not rats. Something bigger. It dragged, then stopped. My stomach went cold. I stared at the ceiling, too scared to even breathe too loud. I stayed like that until dawn bled pale light through the curtains. I checked the audio recording right away. The playback made it worse. The footsteps were there, clear, slow, measured, and the scraping, the deep thud. But what made my skin crawl was the breathing, low, uneven, human, not some random animal. That morning, I called the landlord again. This time, he didn't argue. He said he'd come with someone to check. By noon, he arrived with 2 men and a crowbar. They pried up a section of the floor near the hallway closet, revealing an old hatch sealed with warped wood and nails that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. It took them almost an hour to force it open. Beneath the hatch was a narrow staircase, steep and choked with cobwebs. It led down into a cramped sub-basement that smelled like damp concrete and stale air. The light from above caught dust swirling in the stale space. The landlord went pale when he saw it. He'd clearly never been down there. The police showed up not long after. They went down with flashlights, their boots echoing faintly below. When they came back up, their faces were tight. They said there was an old torn blanket down there, empty food wrappers, fresh cigarette butts. Someone had been living beneath the floor of my room. Not long ago either. The food wasn't more than a couple of days old. They sealed the hatch again, but that didn't change what had happened. Whoever was down there had been moving right beneath me while I slept, listening, breathing. I packed my things that same day. Every sound the house made after that felt wrong. The thought that someone could have been lying under the floor, so close I could hear their breathing through the wood, made it impossible to stay. The police told me they'd keep the house under watch for a while. They didn't find anyone, but they found a small gap at the far end of the foundation, big enough for someone to crawl through. They didn't know how long that person had been down there, or how many nights they'd spent just beneath my bed. When I left, the house looked the same as when I'd moved in. White paint flaking around the windows, quiet street, nothing out of place. But I knew better now. The creaks weren't just the house settling, they were footsteps. Someone else had been in that house with me. Not a ghost, not a noise in my head. A real person. I never went back. Even after I moved, I kept checking floors, corners, crawl spaces, anything that might hide something beneath me. I still remember the exact sound of those creaks outside my door and that soft, slow breathing under the floor. It was the sound of someone too close, someone waiting in the dark where I couldn't see. I've always liked working from home. It gave me a quiet space to do everything without distractions. I live alone in a small one-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of an old brick building. The layout is simple. A short hallway leads to the living room, and the kitchen is tucked to the right. My bedroom door faces the living room. My desk is against the wall right next to the window that opens to the fire escape. The only light at night usually comes from the street lamp outside that spills through the blinds. I keep my laptop closed every night when I finish work. I do it out of habit. I even check twice sometimes because the sound of that click when the lid shuts is a small comfort. It's like closing a book at the end of the day. I also make sure the fire escape window is locked, the front door is dead-bolted, and the lights are off. I live in a quiet neighborhood, not exactly unsafe, but not spotless either. There are old buildings with creaky stairs, dim hallways, and the kind of neighbors who keep to themselves. It's not the kind of place where people watch each other's backs. It's the kind of place where no one really notices anything unless it's loud. That night, I had gone to bed around 11:30 p.m. The apartment was silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I sleep lightly and any small sound wakes me up. So when I opened my eyes at exactly 2:05 a.m., I thought it was just the usual random noise from outside. I lay still for a second, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. Then I heard it again, a faint rhythmic clacking. It was soft at first, just like distant footsteps or someone tapping on a surface. I thought it might be coming from the street below. Sometimes people walk past at night talking or playing music from their phones, but this sound was different. It was steady, familiar, mechanical in a way. A dry tapping sound, rapid, uneven, then pausing. I've heard that sound 1,000 times a day while working. It was the sound of someone typing on my keyboard. For a few seconds, I didn't move. My heart began to pound in a slow, heavy way, the kind that spreads into your throat. I turned my head toward my bedroom door. A strip of faint white light spilled through the narrow gap at the bottom of the door. My laptop was on my desk in the living room. If there was light, it meant it was open. And if it was open, someone had touched it. I live alone. I sat up slowly, trying to keep the bedsheet from rustling too much. I held my breath. The typing went on. A short burst, then a pause, then another burst. Whoever it was wasn't in a hurry. It almost sounded casual, like someone who was comfortable sitting there. I placed my feet quietly on the cold wooden floor. It creaked lightly and the sound stopped. The silence that followed felt heavy and dense, like the air itself had thickened. I didn't turn on the bedroom light. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, but I didn't call anyone yet. I slid the lock on my bedroom door open as slowly as I could. It made a faint click, quieter than usual, but in the silence of the apartment it felt like it echoed down the hall. I pressed my hand against the door and pushed it open a few inches. The living room was dimly lit by the glow of the laptop screen. It cast a cold white light across the floor and onto the coffee table. The screen was open to Google Maps, zoomed in right on my building. I could see the shape of the block, the little markers showing the address and the surrounding streets. The typing had stopped completely. The chair at my desk was turned slightly toward the living room. It wasn't facing me, but it wasn't perfectly straight either. And it was moving. Not fast, just a slow, slight turning, like someone had just stood up and let it spin gently. I whispered one small word, barely audible. It was instinctive. But as soon as the sound left my mouth, the air in the room seemed to tighten. No response. No footsteps, no voice. Just the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the faint creak of the chair coming to a stop. I scanned the living room from the doorway. The curtains were still drawn. The front door was still locked. I could see the deadbolt's shadow. Then I looked at the window by the desk, the fire escape window. The lock was twisted halfway. It was cracked open just enough for someone to slide their fingers through. The next few seconds moved slowly. My pulse was hammering. I didn't step forward. I didn't try to look around the couch or behind the table. I backed up. One slow step, then another. I closed my bedroom door without making a sound and turned the lock. I leaned my back against the door and just listened. I couldn't hear anything moving outside the room. No footsteps on the creaky floorboards. No door opening, no rustling. But silence can be deceptive. Silence in the middle of the night isn't empty. It can hide anything. I slid down to the floor, still holding my phone. My hands were shaking enough that the screen almost slipped. I unlocked it and dialed 911. I didn't raise my voice. I kept my voice low, almost whispering, as I told them what I'd heard. The dispatcher told me to stay where I was, that an officer was already on the way. I remember the minutes after that dragging on like hours. I sat there with my ear pressed lightly against the door. Every little sound in the apartment seemed sharper. The refrigerator hum, the faint ticking of the wall clock in the living room, even the distant traffic. I thought I heard something near the fire escape once, a faint metallic creak, but it might have just been the wind. I didn't breathe deeply. I didn't move. When the knock came at the front door, it was firm and loud. I opened my bedroom door slowly, my hand still gripping the phone. The living room looked the same as before. The laptop was still open, the chair now still. Nothing else seemed touched. I walked cautiously to the door and looked through the peephole. 2 uniformed officers stood there, one shining a flashlight down the hall. I unlocked the door and stepped aside quickly to let them in. They moved with quiet, trained efficiency. One scanned the windows in the living room while the other checked the back. The fire escape window was indeed open. The officer pushed it up fully and leaned out. The metal platform outside creaked softly. Someone had definitely climbed in. They didn't find anyone in the building. The hallway downstairs was empty, and the surrounding area was silent. But they did find faint marks on the fire escape railing, like someone had put weight on it. No fingerprints that could be lifted. No forced entry. Nothing was stolen. My wallet was on the kitchen counter. My phone charger was still plugged in. My work bag was untouched. The only thing disturbed was the laptop. One officer said it was likely someone had climbed up the fire escape quietly, slipped in through the unlocked or weakly locked window, and used my laptop to look around the area, maybe to check for security cameras or escape routes, maybe to see where they were. Then they must have heard me wake up and slipped out the way they came. The thought of it sat in my chest like a heavy weight. They hadn't broken in. They hadn't trashed the place. They hadn't taken anything. But they had been inside. They had stood in the same room where I work every day, touched my desk, typed on my keyboard, sat in my chair, stared at the same screen I use every morning. The officers checked the roof access and the alley, but found nothing useful. They told me to reinforce my windows, maybe get a small camera or alarm for the fire escape side. They wrote a report, took some pictures, and left around 3:30 a.m. When the door clicked shut behind them, the silence returned. It was heavier now. I sat on the couch and stared at the laptop screen. It was still open to Google Maps, zoomed in tight on my building. There were fingerprints on the trackpad, faint smudges that weren't mine. I wiped it clean, but that didn't erase the feeling. I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night. Every creak from the hallway outside, every car passing below, every gust of wind against the window felt sharp and close. The place didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like a door had been opened and couldn't be closed again. Someone had come in quietly, moved through my space without a sound, left without leaving a trace. In the morning, I went to the hardware store and bought new locks for the window. I screwed them in myself. I ordered a cheap camera and a motion sensor for the fire escape. I even moved the desk away from the window. But it didn't change what had happened. Nothing was missing. Not a single thing. But that night, something had been taken anyway. The quiet, the feeling of safety, the comfort of closing my laptop and thinking the day was over, wasn't. It had only been quiet because someone else had been inside, breathing the same air, standing just a few steps away while I slept behind a thin wooden door. And they didn't need to take anything. They already had what they wanted. They'd been here. They'd seen everything. They knew how quiet the place could get. I've always had this habit of shutting off every single light in the house before bed. It's not something I even think about anymore. I go through the same motions every night. Living room lamp off, kitchen light off, hallway light off, then the switch by the stairs. I like the house to feel completely still before I sleep. No buzzing bulbs, no soft yellow glow leaking under the doors. Just quiet and dark. That night was no different. I remember checking the clock on the microwave as I passed through the kitchen. 11:48 p.m. I brushed my teeth, locked the front door, and got in bed. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs. I woke up at 12:33 a.m. I know the time exactly because my phone screen lit up when I picked it up from the nightstand. My throat was dry, the kind of dryness that doesn't go away by just swallowing. I lay there for a moment, deciding whether I wanted to actually get up. The house felt still like it always did at night, but as soon as I opened my bedroom door, I saw it. A soft glow, faint but very real, coming from the kitchen hallway. It wasn't just any light. It was the light from the basement door. I froze for a second, just standing there at the top of the stairs, squinting toward that strip of yellow-white spilling across the floor. My chest tightened. I never left that light on. I hadn't even opened that door in weeks. I hated that basement. The walls were unfinished, the floor was cold concrete, and it always smelled faintly of damp earth no matter how many times I aired it out. I kept my extra boxes and old tools down there, nothing more. I told myself maybe I forgot to turn it off earlier, even though I knew that wasn't true. I turned off every single light before going to bed. Every single night. The kitchen tile felt cold against my bare feet as I walked closer. The glow from the basement light got brighter as I reached the door. I could hear the faint hum of the bulb, that soft electric buzz. My hand hovered over the doorknob for a long time. I didn't want to open it, but at the same time, I needed to. My heart was already beating too fast for how quiet the house was. I twisted the knob slowly and opened the door just enough to see down the steps. The basement light was on. I stood there a few seconds longer, breathing through my nose, trying to steady the shake in my hands. Then I started down the stairs. The steps creaked like they always did. It was the same sound they'd made 100 times before. But about halfway down, right as I was putting my foot on the 4th step, I heard it. A soft sound from below, not the hum of the bulb, not a creak. It was the soft drag of fabric against the concrete floor. It was so faint that if I hadn't been holding my breath, I might have missed it. It came from somewhere deep in the basement, not near the stairs. My body went completely stiff. I reached for the switch on the wall without thinking. Flicked it down. The light went out. The whole basement dropped into darkness so sudden and thick it felt like I'd stepped underwater. For a second, I couldn't even move. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. I turned and scrambled back up the stairs, nearly tripping on the second step because my foot slipped on the edge of the wood. I pushed the door shut hard and shoved a chair underneath the knob, wedging it in place. Then I just stood there in the dark kitchen, breathing. I pressed my back against the wall and tried to hear past the sound of my own breathing. The house was quiet. My pulse was still too loud. Then slowly, beneath everything, I started to hear it again. Not creaking, not pipes, not the refrigerator movement, very slow, very deliberate, coming from below the floor. I lowered myself onto the kitchen floor, sitting with my knees pulled close. The tile was cold against my legs, but I didn't care. I kept my ear tilted slightly toward the door. Every few seconds, I'd hear it again. A faint step, a drag, a pause, then another. It was like someone was slowly walking circles in my basement. I checked my phone. 12:51 a.m. My hands were shaking so much I almost dropped it. I thought about calling someone, but I didn't know what to say. The basement light was on, and now someone might be pacing down there. I didn't even want to speak the words out loud. Saying it would make it real. The minutes crawled by. I didn't move. I just listened. The pacing never turned into running. Never got faster. It stayed the same. Slow, steady, deliberate movements. It was like whoever or whatever was down there was in no rush. At 1:32 a.m., there was a new sound. A faint tap against something metal. It echoed through the floor just enough for me to feel it in my chest. I clenched my hands into fists without meaning to. My throat burned from breathing through my mouth. My mind kept replaying the sound of that fabric dragging on concrete. That was real. That happened. I finally called 911. My voice shook even though I kept it low. I told them someone might be in my basement. They told me to stay where I was and wait for officers to arrive. The pacing didn't stop. If anything, it got quieter. Like whoever was down there knew they needed to move more carefully now. I pressed my palms against the floor to ground myself. I could feel tiny vibrations from below every now and then. Faint but enough to keep me frozen in place. The cops arrived at 1:57 a.m. I didn't even hear their car at first, just the sudden knock at the door. 2 officers went down into the basement while I stood in the hallway with another one, gripping the edge of the counter because my knees wouldn't stop shaking. They were down there for maybe 5 minutes. No voices, no shouting. When they came back up, their faces were calm but serious. The basement was empty. They told me the small window in the corner, just above the foundation line, was cracked open from the inside. It was too small for anyone to comfortably use as an entrance, but not impossible. One of them said whoever it was probably left when they heard me moving upstairs, or when they saw the patrol car pulling in. They didn't find any sign of forced entry anywhere else in the house. Nothing stolen, nothing disturbed, just that one window. But there was something hanging from one of the exposed pipes near the back wall. A dark green jacket. Old, worn, heavy fabric. Not mine. I don't own anything like it. They brought it upstairs in a plastic evidence bag. The inside lining was damp, like it had been out in the cold or wet recently. They asked if I recognized it. I didn't. I'd never seen it before. They searched the surrounding streets and the backyard, but didn't find anyone. After they left, I pushed a heavy dresser against the basement door. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat on the couch with every light in the house turned on, listening to the silence. My mind wouldn't stop replaying those sounds. The fabric dragging on the floor, the soft pacing, the metal tapping. Someone had been down there, not an animal, a person. Someone who had probably been inside long before I woke up. In the morning, I walked down there with one of the officers who came back to take a statement. The air was colder than the rest of the house. There were faint marks in the dust near the back wall. Footprints. Someone had stood there for a long time. I don't know how long they'd been inside. I don't know why they left the jacket. I don't know if they planned to come up those stairs. But I do know one thing. They had gotten in once without me hearing a single sound. That night, after they left, I nailed that basement window shut. Then I bought a motion sensor for every room. I started double locking every door, even the interior ones. But even now, sometimes in the quietest part of the night, I still catch myself listening. Not for creaks, not for pipes, but for slow, steady pacing below my feet. I know that sound too well to ever forget it. I live in a small studio apartment on the third floor of a dull, old building. It's the kind of place where everything feels a little too quiet at night. You can hear the pipes rattle when someone upstairs showers, and the thin walls let in the muffled hum of passing cars from the street below. It isn't fancy, but it's mine. A single open space with a bed pushed against the wall, a tiny kitchenette, one closet, a small bathroom, and a ceiling vent that always made a soft clicking noise when the air kicked on. I've lived there for almost a year. Nothing strange had ever happened before that night. It started like any other night. I brushed my teeth at the small sink in the bathroom. The mirror above it was old and had a tiny crack at the bottom corner that caught the light every time I leaned forward. The air was cool. The only sound was the faint buzz from the old refrigerator. I had left my charger cable plugged into the wall socket by the bed like I always did. It's a habit. Every night, same thing. Brush teeth, wash face, plug in phone, crawl under the thin blanket, sleep. Nothing special. When I stepped out of the bathroom, everything looked normal at first. The room was dim. I keep a single warm light on at night. One of those cheap yellowish bulbs that makes the room feel softer. I reached down to grab my charger cable like I always do, and that's when I noticed it. The cable wasn't loose. It was already plugged into something. My heart gave this weird short thud. For a second, I thought maybe I had plugged my phone in earlier and forgot. But my phone was in my hand. I stared at the end of the charger. A phone was already charging, but it wasn't mine. I know exactly what my phone looks like. It has a cracked corner on the screen protector and a blue case. This one was black, clean, and it had a faint glow from the charging screen, a battery icon slowly pulsing. It was such a small thing, but it didn't fit. It didn't make sense. And in a small studio apartment, things that don't make sense stand out like a siren. The room suddenly felt tight. My throat dried. It's hard to explain that kind of silence. The kind that doesn't sound quiet anymore, but heavy. There aren't many places to hide in a 600-square-foot apartment. I could see almost everything from where I stood. Bed, closet, bathroom door behind me, kitchenette. There was no movement. No sound except the hum of the fridge and the faint ticking from the wall clock above the door. I slowly backed away from the charger, still clutching my phone. My first instinct wasn't smart. It wasn't to run or call anyone. It was to make sure I wasn't imagining things. I bent closer. I could see fingerprints smudged across the black phone's surface. Someone had been here long enough to set their phone down, plug it in, and leave it there. That meant they were either still here, or they had been here recently. My hands were cold. I scanned the room again, this time slower. I opened the bathroom door. Even though I had just been in there brushing my teeth, empty, I pulled back the thin shower curtain. Nothing, just my shampoo bottles lined against the wall and a damp towel hanging from the hook. I moved toward the closet next. It's not a walk-in, just a narrow space with a few jackets, a broom, and a couple of boxes on the floor. I opened it slowly, my fingertips tight on the doorknob. The space was cramped, shadows stretching along the wall, but it was empty too. My mind started racing. The front door had been locked. I'm obsessive about that. I always check it twice before bed. The single window next to the kitchenette was latched. No sign of it being forced. But then I looked up. The ceiling vent. A square metal grate in the center of the ceiling. It was slightly bent downward at one corner. Not a lot. Just enough to be noticeable if you really looked. I had never seen it like that before. I don't know how long I stared at it. Maybe 10 seconds. Maybe longer. long enough for my stomach to turn into a knot. I grabbed the heaviest thing within reach, the lamp on my nightstand. It was a cheap ceramic one, but it felt solid enough in my hands. My heart was pounding so loud I could hear it over the fridge. I walked slowly around the apartment, checking each corner again, even though there was nowhere left to check. Then I stood directly beneath the vent. I could feel the faint movement of air against my face. I stared at the bent corner, at the dark slit between the vent and the ceiling. The thought that someone could be up there settled in my head like a weight pressing down on me. The crawl space above the ceiling wasn't supposed to be accessible. But the building was old. Maintenance guys had been in and out of that crawl space before. If someone knew how, they could probably lift the vent cover and get inside. I imagined someone lying flat on their stomach above me. Someone who had climbed down when I wasn't home, moved around quietly, maybe at night when I was asleep. The charger cable was proof enough. This wasn't just in my head. I didn't make any sudden moves. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the vent. I grabbed my keys from the hook near the door. My phone was still in my hand. I slipped out into the hallway barefoot, heart still hammering. The hallway light was this sick yellow color, flickering at one end. I remember how cold the floor felt against my feet. My neighbor's door down the hall was closed. It was late. Everything was quiet. I went down the stairs fast, 2 steps at a time, out into the cold night air. I called the police from outside. I stood on the sidewalk under a streetlight, staring up at my own apartment window, feeling this strange mix of panic and disbelief. I kept replaying the image of the black phone in my head. It felt impossible, but also too clear to be anything else. I told the dispatcher everything in short, shaky sentences. Someone was in my apartment. I didn't know where, but they had been there long enough to charge their phone. The police came fast. 2 officers. They went in with flashlights and guns drawn while I stood near the front door, with one of them asking me questions I barely answered properly. How long I had lived there, if I had noticed anything missing, if I had heard any strange noises before tonight. I kept saying the same thing over and over. The charger was in use, the vent was bent, someone was in there. My voice sounded strange even to me, thin and shaking. They cleared the apartment slowly, room by room, even though it was just one room. Then one of them climbed onto a chair and pushed up the vent cover. I heard the scraping sound of metal against metal. The officer's flashlight beam vanished into the darkness above the ceiling. Then I heard him say something quietly to his partner. They found shoe scuffs along the wooden frame inside the crawl space, a used blanket shoved between the beams, an empty water bottle, a small plastic bag. Someone had been living up there. For how long, they couldn't tell me. Days, maybe weeks. I hadn't noticed anything. I sleep with earbuds sometimes, and the vent makes little noises on its own, so maybe I ignored the small signs. Maybe I'd been breathing the same air as someone hiding above me night after night. They also found a narrow section where the insulation had been pulled aside, just wide enough for a body to slide through. That's probably how they got in and out. The black phone was taken as evidence. They said they would try to track the owner. After the officers left, I didn't go back inside. I couldn't. I sat in my car in the parking lot downstairs with the heater on low, staring at the faint yellow light shining from my apartment window. I thought about every night I'd spent there alone. Every time I'd heard a faint creak and told myself it was just the building settling. Every time I'd felt a draft and ignored it. Someone could have been watching me sleep, listening to me move around, climbing down when I was gone, plugging their phone into my charger like it was their home too. I moved out a week later, packed my things in silence, and never spent another night in that place. They never told me if they caught the person, just that the crawl space connected several units. Whoever it was could have been slipping between apartments without anyone knowing. What gets me the most isn't what they found. It's the thought of how close it was. The vent was directly above my bed. I'd been sleeping under someone for who knows how long. Maybe they were watching. Maybe they were waiting. Or maybe I just happened to find their charger one night by accident. Either way, it was enough. I still plug my phone in every night. But now, before I do, I check every corner of wherever I'm staying. I look up at the ceiling. I check the vent. I don't ignore little noises anymore. That kind of thing sticks with you. It doesn't leave. I moved into the townhouse in late November, when the air had that sharp, damp chill that seeps into everything. It was an old brick place, narrow and tall, with scuffed wood floors that creaked in a way that was both charming and unsettling. The listing online had called it historic. That word sounded nicer than what it really was. The baseboards were chipped. Some of the walls were slightly uneven. The stairway to the second floor leaned just enough to make me feel it when I walked up. But it was cheap, and I told myself I'd get used to it. The first few nights were quiet in the way a new place is. You hear everything, every sound you'd normally ignore somewhere else. The pipes made these low metallic groans when the heat came on. The old window panes clicked softly when the wind pressed against them. Sometimes there were hollow pops inside the walls that made me stop whatever I was doing and just listen, telling myself it was wood settling. I didn't have much furniture yet. A mattress on the floor upstairs, a small couch, a lamp, and a cheap TV on a stand downstairs. The walls were bare. I hadn't even hung curtains. At night, the streetlight outside washed through the living room windows, laying pale yellow lines across the floor. That night it was quiet enough that I heard the clock on the microwave ticking faintly down the hallway. I'd stayed up too late, not doing anything special. Just scrolling on my phone, half watching some show with the volume low. When I finally decided to go to bed, I remember checking the time on my phone. It was 1:36 a.m. exactly. I turned off the lamp in the living room and stood there for a moment, letting my eyes adjust. The floorboards always groaned when I shifted my weight, and I remember thinking how loud it was in the silence. I took a few steps toward the staircase. That was when I heard it, a voice, faint, muffled, coming from the living room wall. Not outside. Not upstairs. From inside the wall, it was like someone whispering through a thick layer of fabric. Low and close, I froze where I stood, not breathing, trying to be sure I wasn't just imagining it. Then it came again, a slow whisper. The sound slid through the quiet of the house in a way that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I leaned a little toward the wall near the couch. It was clearer there. I could hear the shape of it, though not the words at first. Then it formed one single word, my name Eli, drawn out almost careful, like someone testing it on their tongue. I didn't move. I just stood there, staring at the painted plaster in front of me. None of my neighbors even knew me yet. I hadn't introduced myself. No one had come over. I'd barely even talked to the guy at the gas station down the street. There was no reason anyone should know my name. For a second, I thought maybe it was through the wall, like from the adjoining townhouse. But the sound wasn't clean like that. It didn't come from the other side of plaster. It was inside it, between layers, as if there was space back there. The whispering stopped. Then there was scratching, a light, quick sound, not like an animal scratching for escape. It was deliberate. Drag, pause, drag. I stepped backward toward the staircase and just stood there, feeling the cold edge of panic pressing against my ribs. Stared at that wall for a long time, waiting for the sound to happen again. But it went completely silent. I didn't sleep much the rest of that night. I locked the front door twice. I checked the windows. I sat upstairs on the mattress, the cheap lamp next to me still on. Every little creak in the house felt sharper, more pointed. My heart jumped at random sounds that probably had been there every night before. In the morning, the sun filtered through the thin curtains I'd tacked up, and the house felt stupidly normal. I kept telling myself I must have misheard something. Maybe old houses make weird echoes. Maybe someone outside had called something that sounded like my name. I tried to push it down, but the sound had felt too close. Later that day, I walked through the place trying to figure out if there was any gap, vent, or anything along that living room wall. There wasn't. Just a single old heating grate near the floor that hadn't been used in years. The wall itself felt hollow when I knocked, not like the walls in the hallway or the kitchen. That night, I stayed downstairs later than usual, half waiting to hear it again. The quiet felt different now. Not just old house quiet, expectant, like I wasn't the only one waiting. I kept glancing toward that wall, telling myself I was being ridiculous. At 1:22 a.m., I turned off the lamp and started toward the stairs again. And just like before, it came. A single soft whisper, "Eli." This time it was even closer. I could feel the vibration through the floorboards. I stood frozen with my hand gripping the banister, my eyes on the blank wall. Then came the scratching, slow at first, then a little more frantic. A scrape that trailed downward like nails moving through insulation. I didn't stay downstairs after that. I went straight up, locked my bedroom door, even though that wouldn't really stop anything, and lay awake until the sky started to lighten outside. By the next morning, I couldn't convince myself it was just in my head. I called the property manager. He brushed it off, said it was probably pipes or old house acoustics. I knew what I heard. I didn't argue with him much. I just hung up and sat at the kitchen table staring at my coffee going cold. That day, I started noticing little things I hadn't before. Dust patterns along the baseboard that looked disturbed. A thin line of darker wood at the edge of the living room floor where the wall met it, as if something had rubbed against it over and over. Faint draft near an outlet on that wall. I hardly ate that day. My stomach felt tight the whole time. I didn't want to be in the house when night came again. I tried convincing myself to leave and stay somewhere else, but the thought of coming back and finding something worse made me stay. I wanted to know what was inside. That third night I sat on the couch, the lamp still on, eyes fixed on the wall. 12 hours passed, then 1. I could hear the wind outside brushing against the siding. Then at 1:36 a.m., exactly the same time as the first night, the sound started again, the whisper, "Eli," and then, as if someone was crawling on their hands and knees, I heard a slow drag moving further along the wall toward the corner. The drywall made a faint, dull echo with each shift. I realized with a cold clarity that whatever was inside wasn't just whispering, it was moving. I stood up slowly. The sound stopped the second I took a step. The silence after was worse than the noise itself. The next morning I called the fire department. I didn't even try to explain everything. I just said I thought there was someone in my walls. They showed up late morning with a couple of guys in gear, flashlights and tools. One of them tapped along the wall, listening. The sound was hollow. They ran a camera scope through a small hole first. The guy with the flashlight didn't say much, but the way he paused made my skin prickle. Then they cut through the drywall. The opening revealed a narrow space I hadn't known existed. It wasn't just the wall. It was a long, thin cavity running the length of the house between the inner drywall and the original brick structure. About 3 feet wide. Just enough for someone to move through if they wanted to. Inside, in the dust, there were water bottles, still half full, a rolled-up blanket, a flashlight with a low battery, a plastic container with food wrappers inside. It wasn't old junk. It was recent. Someone had been living in there, right next to where I slept every night. The realization came in pieces. How the whisper had felt close. How it had always happened around the same time. How I'd thought it was just the house. The firefighters pulled everything out and called the police. I watched from the corner of the room, my hands cold and damp as they checked the length of the space. They didn't find anyone inside, but they did find more signs. A flattened patch of insulation, footprints in the dust, scuffed marks against the brick. Whoever had been in there had spent real time moving around. The police asked questions. I answered what I could. I hadn't seen anyone. I hadn't heard anything besides the whispering and scratching. They said they'd check for forced entry points, but the unnerving part was that the access had probably been through the basement crawl space. A place I hadn't checked since moving in. They left after boarding up the wall temporarily, but the house didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like a place that had been shared without me knowing. A place someone else had known more intimately than I did. I changed the locks that same day. I sealed the basement door with a deadbolt I installed myself. I bought motion lights for the backyard, but the worst part wasn't what they'd found. It was what they hadn't. They hadn't found the person. Whoever had been living in the wall was still out there. They'd had blankets, water, a flashlight. They'd been whispering my name. For weeks after, I couldn't sleep through the night. I stopped sitting in the living room. I stayed upstairs, lights on, waiting for something to scrape against the walls again. It never did. But knowing someone had been in there, just feet from me, whispering while I slept was worse than if it had happened again. It meant they'd known I'd found out. It meant they'd left on their own. When I finally moved out 3 months later, I didn't look back at the house. The new lock gleamed on the front door as I closed it. Someone else would live there now. Maybe they'd never hear a thing. But every now and then, I still wake up around 1:36 a.m., and for a second I expect to hear my name whispered through a wall that isn't even mine anymore. My bedroom door locks from the inside with an old brass turn lock. It's not fancy or modern. It's one of those heavy, slightly loose ones that you have to twist hard until it clicks. I always make sure to twist it before sleeping. It's become a habit. Every single night, right before I switch off the lamp, I reach for it, twist it, and give the knob a small pull to make sure it's secure. I live alone, and small things like that make me feel safe. That morning, I woke up at 4:19 a.m. to the sound of the door slowly opening. I didn't even move at first. It was a soft creak, the kind the old door makes when it's pushed too slowly to slam. I shot upright in bed and just stared at it. My room was dim. Only a bit of faint streetlight leaked through the curtains. The door wasn't wide open. It was open 2 inches, just enough for the darkness of the hallway to leak into the room like a black line. The brass lock was still turned. I could see it from where I sat. It was facing down, the way it always looks when locked, but the door was open. My heart started beating hard in my chest. I held my breath, straining my ears to hear anything, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no breathing, just the sound of the house itself being still. I stared at the edge of the door until my eyes began to ache. I reached slowly toward my nightstand where my phone was charging. The charger cable scraped lightly against the wood, louder than I wanted it to be. I turned on the flashlight and aimed it toward the hallway. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on the white wall and the edge of the rug. Nothing moved. I scanned up and down the hallway. It was empty. The small shelf near the bathroom door was exactly the same as it had been. The hallway light switch was off, same as every night. The air was heavy and quiet. Then I noticed it. A faint smell. Cigarette smoke. Not strong, but enough that it didn't belong. I don't smoke. Nobody who visits me smokes. The smell drifted through the open crack of the door like something stale left behind. I sat there frozen, clutching my phone, listening, waiting. My room was cold. I hadn't even realized I was sweating until a drop slid down my back. I forced myself to move. Slowly, I pushed the blanket aside and got out of bed. The floor was cold under my feet. I crept toward the door, careful not to let the wood creak beneath me. My fingers reached for the edge and pushed it open another inch. It moved smoothly, too smoothly. The lock hadn't even clicked back. It was still in place. I turned the flashlight down the hall again. The bathroom door was open like always. The front door at the far end of the hall was closed. All the windows in the living room had their curtains drawn. The heater made a faint humming sound. I stood there for maybe 2 minutes just listening. Nothing. The smell of cigarette smoke still lingered, faint but steady, like someone had been standing right outside my door a minute ago. I stepped into the hallway. Every step felt too loud. I checked the front door. Still locked from the inside. The bolt was slid across. Nothing broken. Nothing forced. I checked every window. All of them were locked. The kitchen window was still stiff, just like always. When I came back to my room, I stared at the brass lock again. I tried to push the door. It didn't budge. When the lock was turned, it was supposed to hold. That night it hadn't. I didn't sleep again. I sat in bed with my back against the headboard. Flashlight still on. My ears tuned to every sound. The refrigerator hum. The distant traffic. Even the pipes shifting. Every little noise felt sharper. When the sun came up, I checked the lock again in full light. Nothing seemed wrong, but when I pressed gently on the bolt, I noticed how loose it was. If someone knew what they were doing, They could probably force it from the outside, without breaking it. Tried not to think about that too much. I kept the hallway lights on the next night. It didn't help much. At 3:57 a.m. I woke up again. This time not to the door opening but to silence. I checked it immediately. Locked. Still. But the cigarette smell was there again. Not strong. Faint, like something old clinging to the air. It was enough to make my stomach feel tight. The next few days I made small changes. I pushed a chair under the door handle before bed. I kept my phone on with the flashlight app ready. I walked through the house every night before locking up, checking doors and windows twice. I even started leaving the television on low volume in the living room so I could tell if it suddenly changed or went silent. Nothing happened for 2 nights. Then on the third, I woke up at almost the exact same time, 4:17 a.m. The chair under the door handle was still upright, but the smell was there, stronger this time. It wasn't stale anymore. It was fresh, like someone had just put out a cigarette outside my room. I got out of bed fast, pressed my ear to the door. I could hear something faint. It wasn't footsteps exactly, more like fabric brushing against something. A slow shift, then silence. I didn't open the door this time. I waited. 5 minutes passed. 10, 15, my pulse wouldn't slow down. Eventually, I forced myself to open it quickly. Hallway empty. The next morning, I called a locksmith. I didn't want to wait for something else to happen. When he came, he looked at the old lock and didn't even need long. He explained that these kinds of locks weren't very secure, that the bolt could be pushed back with something thin and flat. A tool, no damage, no forced entry. He told me in a calm voice that it wouldn't even take someone more than a few seconds if they knew what they were doing. I changed the lock that day. Not just the bedroom door, but the front door too. I bought a camera for the hallway. I moved the furniture in the hallway so I'd notice if anything shifted. That night, for the first time in a week, I fell asleep a little easier. But at 4:12 a.m., the hallway camera notification went off on my phone. Motion detected. I opened the app immediately. The image showed a grainy view of the hallway. Nothing moved, but the feed caught it. A faint streak of smoke drifting past the bedroom door, like someone had just exhaled and walked out of frame. The door stayed shut that night. Nobody tried to open it. The chair didn't move. The lock held. But whoever had come in those first nights hadn't forced their way. They didn't break anything. They just walked in and out like it was easy. I installed another camera by the front door the next day. Better lock, a sensor. I stopped sleeping through the night completely. I began setting an alarm at 3:55 a.m., just to be awake before anything happened. The smell still came sometimes. Not every night, but enough that it felt like a reminder. A locksmith can fix a lock, but they can't tell you who already knows how to get past it. Whoever opened that door the first night didn't need to come back to prove they could. And that's the part I can't shake. I keep the lights on now. I double-check every lock. I've made my house a cage with me inside it. Every time the hallway creaks, even just the house shifting, I wake up fast. It's always around the same time, always quiet, always that faint trace of smoke in the air that doesn't belong to me. The new locks are stronger. But so was the old one until it wasn't.